place. But it led me, as I thought about the situation in Tehran and the leadership uncertainty there, to want to ask Jon Meacham, eminent presidential historian, what's the nature of leadership for an American president in wartime? Because Donald Trump, in a way that really he hasn't faced before, now confronts that question, John. What does a wartime leader do in America in a big war?
Well, it depends on the era, obviously. Our friend Michael Beschloss wrote a monumental book about this called Presidents of War. What we're seeing now is an imperial presidency, a phrase coined in the early 1970s in the wake of Korea and Vietnam by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And Arthur meant it as sort of a criticism. Let's leave that aside for a second. It is, in fact, a descriptor. I've been getting a lot of questions, as I'm sure you have, from people saying, how can a president do this? Well, this is what presidents do. And it's why, it's this example 7012 of why presidential elections matter so much. In many ways, the projection of force since World War II, which was the last time we declared war officially in the constitutional sense, has been for presidents, if you will, to ask forgiveness rather than permission, that phrase. They tend to act. Now, the Bushes both went to the UN and to Congress, but President Bush 41, and Richard Haas knows all about this, President Bush 41, in August of 1990, when he was contemplating war to remove Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait, had a resolution in Congress, went to the UN, but repeatedly told his diary, I think it was 7 times, that he was willing to be impeached because he had convinced himself of the righteousness and efficacy and necessity of this mission. And so even if Congress, and you'll remember, David, how close a vote that was, in 1990-91, he was willing to do it. And he was willing to act in a unilateral way. And we think of George Herbert Walker Bush as kind of this embodiment of the wise men ethos, which I think it's safe to say President Trump has not usually evoked in most people's minds. Character as a war president is destiny in the way that character in the presidency, broadly put, is destiny. Because the way power has evolved is that presidents do have an extraordinary amount of leeway to project our military force. A final point is successful war presidents, which is what they all want to be, are in fact the ones who make the case, who explain why we are expending blood and treasure. Those who try to do it unilaterally, though they can, tend to regret it. And so that's, I think, an important lesson of history for President Trump to be thinking about and this is not a partisan point, right? I mean, and by the way, as we all know, this was a terrible regime, killing protesters, exporting terrorism. So this is not a reflexively ideological criticism of the president. It is, as you ask, a historically based point that if you want a democracy to go to war and to support you, let us in, explain it to us. FDR said in the February of 1942 that the news is going to get worse and worse before it gets better and better. And the American people deserve to have it straight from the shoulder. Give it to us straight from the shoulder, and history tells us we'll do what it takes. Try to tell us that it's not that big a deal or that successes outnumber failures. Ask President Johnson how well that worked out.
Yeah, and you look at the history of Winston Churchill in 40 and 41 during the Battle of Britain. He always told the unvarnished truth to the British people and let them know that things were like FDR were going to get worse before they got better, and they remained patient. You know, as I was listening, Richard Haass, to Jon Meacham talking about bringing the American people along, I was so reminded by the lessons of the Vietnam War. Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger, setting out the 4 aims, the Weinberger Doctrine, which Colin Powell added to it, which is before you go in, know what the triggering event is that you come out. And one of those 4 or 5 things that people like Colin Powell especially believed were important because they were fighting a war in Vietnam that the American people didn't support was getting the public on your side. Talk about what you saw with Bush 41 and what you would recommend for this administration, how to bring the American people along. What did Bush 41 do in the lead up to the first Iraq War? And what would you recommend this president do to get the American people on his side in this war?
I'll talk about it, Joe, but I want to come back to one big difference between the two, because we've talked about Vietnam, we've talked about the Gulf War. There's a difference between wars of necessity and wars of choice when it comes to selling them to the American people in the world. Gulf War, we arguably had vital national interests at stake. Iraq invaded. World War II was obviously that case. I would think Vietnam, the Iraq War of 2003, this one, we can question whether our vital interests were at stake. We also had other possible policies, whether it was negotiations, economic sanctions, whatever. My point is simply that when it is a war of choice, it puts far greater pressure, far greater premium on a president making the case. Why are the costs worth it when we had other options? Why are the costs worth it when the interest at stake might be important, but not necessarily vital? So in 1990 and 91, President Bush 41, again, I think had the advantage of we were reacting to an Iraqi invasion. But what he did is he went to the American people repeatedly, and he went to the United Nations repeatedly. He went to the Congress repeatedly, and he did one other thing, Joe. He kept our aims limited. What he tried to do was say, okay, here's what we're going to do, but we're not going to do more than we have to. This president has basically, I think, violated every one of those rules. He hasn't gone to the American people. He hasn't gone to the Congress. He hasn't gone to the international community, to the UN. And his aims are extraordinarily expansive, even worse, and the general can talk to this. He's articulated aims that you can't give to a general or an admiral and say, accomplish these. Regime change is not a military mission. What we can do is perhaps set the table for it. We can destroy munitions. We can kill leaders. But offshore, you cannot bring about regime change. So I think this president, the only way the lessons of 1990 and 91 kick in is he really needs to start to articulate a much more doable and narrow set of war aims, or he's going to get in trouble.
And General, you've obviously have experience that nobody here has, and most people watching do not have. What do troops in the field need to hear, not only from their president, but from political leaders? I mean, they're focused on the objective. They're focused on the mission, I'm sure, and tune out most of it. But I was always struck by Colin Powell talking about his experiences in Vietnam and the need for public support when you're out there with you and your buddies putting their lives on the line. Talk about what they need while fighting this war.
Any war is very dangerous, Joe. We all know that. What Jon Meacham and Richard just said really sings to me, because I think it just reflects back on the statement of, with great power, which the president has, comes great responsibility. And that goes beyond just telling people to pull triggers. It goes to the bringing the nation on board. It goes to talking to the press about exactly what the plan is. It is the hard work of building alliances and getting support from the international community. All of those things are required. Now, when you're talking at the soldier level, they want to know why they're there. What I would say is it goes beyond, hey, do this and hit that target. Any rhesus monkey can do that. But when you're talking about people coming from a democratic nation, you want to know why you potentially might suffer consequences and have to sacrifice to support and defend the Constitution. From my perspective, those things aren't present. We don't know what this is about. We don't know why we've been in there other than to change a regime. Well, that's a grand hand wave of a statement of an objective. There's got to be more to it than that. Because, as you said at the beginning of this segment, there have now been 3 F-15 shot down by friendly fire, because that kind of stuff happens in war. It's the fog, it's the chaos, it's all the dynamics. So you want as much clarity as a soldier as you can possibly get, and that includes, what the heck is the mission? What are we trying to do other than just attack and bomb?
Right, and I think there's such a distrust in the Trump administration of the press, of politicians, of diplomats, that so much is kept closely held. Like, for instance, in the long conversations I had this weekend, I was told that the overall goal is Venezuela, Iran, Russia, ultimately getting that oil out of the hands of China, so it cuts off the ability for China to get cheap oil. And I could go on in a very long way about how this is part of their overarching plan, but that's not conveyed to the American people. Everything right now is conveyed at an ad hoc basis, and I think a part of it is because there's such a distrust coming from this administration of allies, of the media, of other people that presidents would usually talk with. And so that has a lot of people asking the question of what exactly is going on right now and what is the long-range plan.